Welcome to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. Coming up, we'll review the week's top stories about Chicago Mayor-elect Brandon Johnson's address to the state legislature, the latest in challenges against Illinois' gun ban, and more. I'll then join the Center Square executive editor Dan McCaleb to further discuss the news. That's ahead with Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop.
Between the Consumer Price Index, inflation, and job reports, it feels like you need a PhD in economics to fully understand the economic news happening around us every day. That's why you need the Everyday Economics Podcast. Join host Chris Krug and economist Dr. Orphe Devungi as they help you understand the economic world happening around you every day. Listen to the Everyday Economics Podcast at americastalking.com or wherever you get your podcast.
Welcome back to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. Here's some of the top stories from the past week. Newly elected Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson was in Springfield on Wednesday to discuss his agenda for the Windy City. Andrew Hensel has more.
Johnson defeated former Chicago Public Schools CEO Paul Vallis in an April runoff election to become Chicago's 57th mayor. Johnson spoke before the Illinois General Assembly on Wednesday and said that he is ready to work with communities all over the state.
I want to take a moment to lay out in a very specific way, in front of all of you, my vision for how Chicago and Springfield can work together to deliver for the people of Illinois.
Johnson says he will focus on three elements he values while in office.
See, I believe we can show every community in Illinois that in our hearts, we treasure the lives, the safety, the economic security, and the rights of all Illinoisans.
Johnson will replace current Mayor Lori Lightfoot next month. I'm Andrew Hensel.
Some downstate Illinois lawmakers voicing concerns over the Chicago mayor-elect's proposed spending spree. Kevin Bessler has that story.
Johnson paid a visit to Springfield Wednesday and told lawmakers that Chicago and other cities need funding to offer various programs for its residents.
I made, I think a pretty emphatic statement about making sure that municipalities across the state of Illinois, have revenue, right, to do the necessary work.
Johnson said his time at the Statehouse is about building a better, stronger, and safer Chicago by establishing a strong foundation for collaboration. State Senator Terry Bryant says history shows that Illinois taxpayers may have to pick up the tab for Johnson's agenda.
So far, my history here in 9 years has been when you say spend, 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 spend. The history of the city and the history of this state has been spend into a forced tax increase.
Bryant says Johnson should do the things he promised to do, but with the money he has available to him. I'm Kevin Bessler.
Meanwhile, the Illinois Supreme Court denied a motion to disqualify two justices from hearing a challenge to the state's new gun ban over perceived conflicts of interest. The two justices also declined to recuse themselves. Before being elected in 2022 to the Illinois Supreme Court, Justices Elizabeth Rochford and Mary O'Brien each received $1 million campaign contributions from Governor J.B. Pritzker. The attorney for State Representative Dan Calkins filed a motion for the two to recuse themselves from hearing a challenge of the governor's gun ban. Late Friday, both justices and the court denied the recusal disqualification motion. Republican State Representative Brad Halbrook had asked about the issue during a recent appropriation committee. After Friday's ruling, Halbrook was disappointed.
The optics doesn't look very good. This just lessens the amount of trust that people place in government and in the judiciary.
The case is set to be heard in mid-May. Meanwhile, a challenge to Illinois' gun and magazine ban continues with the law in place after a federal appeals court rejected a motion to halt the law pending appeal. The case, Beavis v. Naperville, was filed last year challenging the city's gun ban. Plaintiffs modified the federal case to include the state's gun ban enacted in January. In February, a federal judge from the Northern District of Illinois ruled the state's ban is constitutional. Plaintiffs appealed to the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals with a request the law be blocked pending appeal. Tuesday, an appeals court denied that motion. GPAC board member John Schmidt said gun control advocates got a win, but the case continues.
So are we impairing the right to bear arms because we limit the ability to buy certain types of weapons? I think my common sense answer to that is no, but we have to see ultimately what the Supreme Court says about that.
Schmidt said things could get interesting with a challenge in the Southern District of Illinois Federal Court, where a ruling on whether to block the law is pending. Those are the top stories from the past week from Illinois. Find more online at americastalking.com. Coming up for Illinois in Focus, I'll join the Center Square Executive Editor Dan McCaleb. This is Illinois in Focus, the production of America's Talking Network. I'm Greg Bishop.
Freedom and liberty are important to all of us in Illinois, from Rockford to Carbondale, from Quincy to Decatur. If you're looking for civil, intellectual conversations with those shaping the future of freedom, try the Future of Freedom podcast with me, Scott Bertrand. We speak with leaders across the country in the greater conservative and libertarian movements. In-depth conversations about where the next intellectual battles will happen across the country. It's the Future of Freedom podcast. Find it at americastalking.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
Greetings and welcome to Illinois in Focus, powered by the Center Square. I'm Dan McCaleb, Executive Editor of the Center Square Newswire Service. Joining me today is Greg Bishop, the Center Square's Illinois Editor and Senior Springfield Reporter. How are you, Greg?
I am good, Dan. And yourself?
Doing well. We are recording this on Thursday, April 20th. Yesterday, Wednesday, Chicago Mayor-elect Brandon Johnson visited the state capitol in Springfield to address a joint session of the General Assembly. Greg, you were there. What did Johnson say, and what was the reaction?
Yeah, the mayor-elect giving a first of his career address to the Illinois General Assembly, a joint session of the Senate and the House, and he laid out his priorities. He talked about the state being a, quote, vanguard for progressive ideas. He mentioned being good for labor. He talked about abortion access. He talked about the importance of unifying the state. He discussed how the city of Chicago is a major economic driver with a lot of business and a lot of culture. But he also did recognize that rural parts of the state provide invaluable resources by way of agriculture and a variety of other things. So he laid out his vision for Chicago and also how he's going to address crime and in particular talking about making sure that there's mental health resources for law enforcement. He wants to hire 200 new detectives to solve crimes. He also talked about ensuring that there are trauma programs for young people. And as well as highlighting how he wants more resources for K through 12 education for Chicago public schools, and even saying that he wants a school nurse in every school in Chicago. But the mayor-elect also took a bit of a partisan angle when he was addressing the legislature. A lot of what he said, Democrats stood and applauded, while Republicans mostly sat still and did not stand. And in particular, you had Johnson talk about the blue wall, he called here in Illinois, with Democrats being in the supermajority of both the House and the Senate, and pushing those progressive ideas that he championed. So a lot of different things he laid out there. But some Republicans say they did not hear how he's going to pay for all of these things.
Before we get into Republican reaction, Greg, I didn't think of it beforehand. I listened to his speech remotely. And if I were playing a drinking game and took a drink every time he said the word progressive, I'd have been on the floor about 15 minutes in. So he's definitely considers himself a progressive, is going to push progressive policies in Chicago. What do Republicans have to say about that?
So the initial reaction I got was from House Minority Leader Tony McCombie, and immediately after the speech, she said that it was the most partisan speech she's heard being given by somebody visiting the legislature in her time at the statehouse. She talked about that being disconcerting. She also said that while they heard a lot about new programs, there was nothing in there about how to pay for it, which is a red flag. She says that could lead to tax increases and possibly even a, quote, bailout for Chicago. But she also, again, highlighted the partisan nature of it, saying that before Johnson's speech, Johnson went around and talked to various caucuses, but did not talk with the Republican leadership. She said that was unfortunate as well. Also got response from State Senator Terry Bryant, who was in the chamber. And immediately afterwards, she as well said that all she heard was spend, 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 but nothing about how to pay for all of that spending. Something she says in her time at the State House indicates that there's going to be some kind of revenue enhancements, which for us means taxpayer increases. So obviously there's a lot of interpretation of what Johnson said and how he's going to pay for it. But shortly after Johnson's speech, the Illinois Freedom Caucus, which consists of various Republicans from across the state, they took to a news conference and essentially said that the Marxists have taken over, and State Representative Blaine Wilhauer using those words, even saying, "Lord, help us." Others in the Freedom Caucus said that the blue wall comments, people need to move out of what they called the dumpster fire of Chicago and move to rural parts of the states to create a red wall. And a variety of other comments also around what we saw happen on the streets of Chicago last weekend. This made national headlines with hundreds of youth out on the streets, even in broad daylight, with dozens of them hopping on top of cars and smashing car windows and lighting vehicles on fire. 2 people were ultimately shot in all of that chaos. And Republicans were very critical of Johnson, who put out a statement saying, while he doesn't condone crime, you can't demonize young people because of a lack of opportunity, Johnson said. Well, State Representative Blaine Wilhauer he responded to that directly, saying that it's Democratic policies that have led to a lack of opportunity in Chicago, and Democrats need to essentially reflect on that. And Republicans have said that they've got the policies that would lower taxes and encourage businesses to move back to Illinois, thereby giving people those opportunities. But he says people in rural parts of the state, they as well have felt the lack of opportunities because of what Republicans say are poor Democratic policies.
Wow. You mentioned that what happened last weekend in Chicago, and that happened in some very tourist-heavy parts of the Loop area. I even had
it wasn't in Austin, it wasn't in Chatham, it wasn't in some of these various areas where you hear regular crime stories. Yeah, it was downtown in a heavily populated tourist area, and that's not a good Chicago postcard, as one state senator said.
I saw that comment from our reporting on this at thecentersquare.com. I actually had a friend who visited me in Chicago about 5 years ago, I guess, shortly before the pandemic, and he texted me over the weekend after seeing the reporting on that and said he told me, "I'm never coming to Chicago again." So that's got to be tourism has to be a big concern when these kinds of stories make national news.
Well, and even the Illinois Chamber of Commerce said that crime has to be addressed in Chicago because it does heavily impact tourism, which is one of the major drivers of Chicago, which everybody in the state recognizes. Chicago's a major economic driver for the state. And if tourism's hurts, and if businesses are hurt and that they can't operate successfully, that's not going to have good outcomes for Chicago or for the state.
Brandon Johnson officially becomes mayor next month, replacing outgoing Mayor Lori Lightfoot. Certainly wish him luck. Greg, let's move on. We have more updates on the challenge to Illinois' statewide gun ban. The big news coming late Friday when the Illinois Supreme Court and 2 justices on the Illinois Supreme Court responded to a request that those 2 justices recuse themselves because they both received $1 million in campaign contributions from Governor J.B. Pritzker, who is the primary defendant in these lawsuits challenging the gun ban. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, so ultimately you had the Macon County case in state court. These aren't the federal challenges. This is all state court. From Macon County, directly appealed to the Illinois Supreme Court. We saw that 2 of the Supreme Court justices received $1 million each from Governor J.B. Pritzker, a lead defendant in the case. But also they received 6-figure donations from House Speaker Emanuel Chris Welch before they were elected.
Who's also a defendant in this case, right?
He's a lead defendant in this case, absolutely.
Well, yes.
So that was part of the rationale behind an official motion that the plaintiffs in this case filed with the Illinois Supreme Court, saying that the unreasonably large campaign contributions plus the what's the word I'm thinking of here? The optics of these Supreme Court justice candidates standing with gun control advocates. The plaintiff said those things should lead to these justices recusing themselves or for the Supreme Court to disqualify them. Well, late Friday, 2 weeks after that motion for recusal or disqualification was filed, the two Supreme Court justices separately issued orders denying that motion for them to recuse themselves. Elizabeth Rochford and Mary O'Brien separately made those orders. Rochford's order was a little bit more lengthy than O'Brien's, where Rochford said that there's no evidence of any impropriety. There's no evidence that she made any statements supporting gun control. She even went as far as to say that plaintiffs in the case are filing this, or it's safe for the court to assume plaintiffs are filing this motion for recusal to try to heat off any outcome of the case that might be detrimental to the plaintiff's cause, which is an interesting statement to make in that recusal order denying the motion for recusal. And the Supreme Court ultimately came back and said that they don't have the power to disqualify any of the justices in this case. So when the Illinois Supreme Court hears the challenge against Illinois' gun ban, it's going to be a full panel of all 7 justices with a Democratic-leaning court. Those 2 justices will be on the bench hearing this, and we'll see what the next steps are, if there are any at all, because the plaintiff's attorney, Jerry Stocks, he said in a statement to the Center Square that they'll now focus on the arguments in front of the courts, and they'll determine what other types of next steps there could be to address the what some see as a perceived bias from these 2 Supreme Court justices. And just to kind of step back, when we first started reporting on this, we went to a completely independent, out-of-state organization focused on judicial ethics. And they told us, they said it's not the direct implication of impropriety. It's even the assumed and just the optics alone could do damage to the public's perception of what a judge and what a judiciary ultimately does. And if you have that damage done to the perception of the impartiality of a judiciary, that can lead to some negative ramifications with society and the understanding of our 3 branches of government all being a check and balance on each other.
Even the appearance of partiality can be a big problem for the judiciary. I read Judge Rochford's ruling. It's almost as if she took the request to have her recuse herself personally, based on the reading of her response. Greg, you wrote a couple other stories on. There's so much going on in the gun ban challenge cases, multiple state lawsuits, multiple federal lawsuits. You wrote a couple other stories about it. Anything else noteworthy to share with our listeners about updates? What's going on there?
Yeah, so we talked about the state level cases, and everybody's waiting to see how it's argued in the state level courts mid-May. But then you get into the federal cases, and there's some interesting stuff going on there. And try to keep this as succinct as possible. You have 3 federal districts in Illinois: the Northern, the Central, and the Southern District federal courts. Well, last week we had the Southern District take up consolidated cases, and a judge heard those arguments, and we're still anticipating a ruling on an injunction against the law, which would block the law statewide. It would block the state law statewide. So that's in the Southern District. We're still waiting on that. In the Northern District, last year in the fall, Law Weapons and Robert Beavis, he sued the city of Naperville because of Naperville's gun ban. So that case has already proceeded and gone through the motions and is the furthest along of all of these gun ban challenges, but it was just focused on Naperville's gun ban. Well, after the state enacted the state-level gun ban, the plaintiffs in the Naperville case, Law Weapons, they amended their complaint to include a challenge of the state law. And since the case was so far along, back in February, a Northern District federal judge sided with the states and said they can ban dangerous and unusual weapons, saying that AR-15s, for instance, are dangerous and unusual. While the plaintiffs in that Northern District case filed an appeal to the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, but with that appeal, they also put a motion in for an injunction pending appeal. Earlier this week, the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, without giving any reason why, denied that motion for a preliminary injunction pending appeal. The appeal's still going forward, but the state law is going to stay in place while that appeal moves forward. Where it gets really interesting, back to the Southern District. If we have the Southern District judge issue a statewide injunction on the law, then the state law would be suspended pending appeal. But when it comes to the Naperville case, it wouldn't impact the city of Naperville's gun ban. And that's an interesting dynamic that's going to develop here in the next few weeks as we anticipate some kind of action from the Southern District federal courts in the challenge against Illinois' gun ban.
Interesting. Again, just based on everything you said there, don't understand how you can keep up with all of these moving parts and pieces related to Illinois' gun ban and the challenges.
I think that I'm going to probably have to work towards my junior law degree after all this, Dan.
They should just give it to you, Greg. All right, time to move on, though, Greg. The Center Square has been in the courtroom or in the courthouse for every second of the ComEd 4 trial over the last several weeks, and it looks like the case might be going to a jury next week. Defense attorneys wrapped up their case on Wednesday. The jury was not in today, so there was no open courtrooms, but attorneys were preparing their closing arguments and also jury instructions, working with the judge on how he's going to instruct the jury before he sends them out to deliberate the case. So as early as next week, we could have a verdict. Any thoughts?
I think the most compelling thing since we talked last was that not just one, but 2 of the 4 defendants in this case actually decided to provide testimony, including cross-examination. So we had talked about how Ann Pramaggiore, the former ComEd CEO for Exelon, she testified, and we also had John Hooker testify. And this is interesting to see how that played out with all the evidence that federal prosecutors had, from emails to wiretaps to even undercover recordings. I think one thing that's interesting is that Hooker said that some of the conversations he had with another defendant, Michael McLean, he was just, quote, joshing around about things that some could perceive as corrupt. So whether or not that's going to help both Hooker and Pramaggiore in their defense, yet to be seen. But you've got Michael McLean and also Jay Doherty also facing these charges. They've all pleaded not guilty, but I think the jury's going to have a lot to pour through with all the different charges, with all of the different evidence, from audio to video to emails, and even, pictures taken of notes on a notepad. It takes a unanimous standing of the jury. If just one person decides that, no, I don't think they're guilty, we could get a hung jury.
And that's on every single count that, as you referenced, for every single defendant. So you could have a split jury decision, too.
Yeah, and one thing's for sure is this is going to be very instructive for both prosecutors and the defense of Michael Madigan and Michael McLean, who next year will face additional charges.
As usual, Greg, thank you for your insight into all of these important stories. But that's all the time we have. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com. For Greg Bishop, I'm Dan McCaleb, and thanks for listening.